Hi, everybody. We are here again. The week has flown by and we are jumping into our second episode of Future Ready. Morning, Jake. How are you?
Morning. I'm great. I'm in the middle of birthday celebrations here, as you can see behind me, for my daughter who turned 11 today.
How does that feel?
Strange. I have strange dreams about the fact that she's getting older and, it's sort of a transition moment. So yeah, it affects you as a parent in different ways as your children kind of transition between these different ages, like within their childhoods. Each kind of section is a little bit different from the last.
Yeah, amazing. So, so we're on second chat. I thought leading on, we had some great engagement from last week. So I thought we would kind of take a step on from what we were talking about and I guess start to introduce people to where we've come from. I think it's always important if we're looking forward and obviously a lot of what we do with season one is very much look forward and prepare people for the environments in which they're going to occupy, right? And the skills with which they need, right, to survive. And we're very real about how we talk about that. There's an element of survival right now, but also thriving in those kind of opportunities of the future. So I think it's always prudent that if we're looking forward, I don't think we can do that without kind of looking back a little bit and kind of see how football and those environments have changed and how actually it can shape those environments that you guys listening and we currently occupy and the teams that we work in. So I know, Jake, that again, a lot of work goes into this kind of explaining this old performance paradigm and new performance paradigm. I wonder if you could just kind of, let's start with the old performance. Give us I guess an introduction to old performance, and we can jam on some examples because I know that both of us, me especially, have plenty of examples of what that looks like in real life.
Yeah, okay. So it's a really imperfect way, I think, of understanding how performance has changed over the last 2 decades, and perhaps a little bit more. And it's really just trying to draw a bracket around the experiences that athletes and coaches and performance critical staff, and also actually the wider community, the media as well, right? Fans, everybody really, the club as a whole, have around the performance critical space. And in the old performance paradigm, which again, it's a terrible name for it, right? It's just like the best that we had lying around at the time. You tended to see these environments be very secretive, very closed. In those environments, athletes were encouraged to really focus on the sport that they were playing, and that if they didn't do that, that perhaps they would end up losing their chance, right? They were governed by particularly ruthless language and discourse. And a lot of the conversation was driven from, let's say, linguistic homes that were around invasion and war, right? And defense, siege, these sorts of kind of ways of thinking about self and others. In the new performance paradigm, things change. So maybe we can talk about that in a lot more detail soon. But that old performance paradigm, we can see that kind of beginning to have its time come to an end sometime in the 2000s, right? And it depends really from, country to country, from sport to sport, and also from club to club. And certainly I think what's going on right now with the World Cup is a really great, if we can relate it to national teams, then probably the way the English team began to change, had its seeds a little bit earlier, but then, really saw fruit coming into the 2010s and the big changes that happened then, which led up to the success that both the women's and the men's team have seen since that point.
There's probably a better name for old performance paradigm, but it does package it really well. And I think in terms of like my personal experience with that.
Yeah, because I often think of you because you played in it.
Yeah,
So you sort of have this felt experience of it.
and actually quite deeply. And I would actually, the more I think about it, the more we converse about this subject. And obviously, the longer we go, I work on myself and kind of look back. Is actually I think I first experienced this kind of tangibility of old performance when I think I was 10 years old. I must have been, because I was at Chelsea's academy at the time. And I remember we were playing down, I think we were playing Brighton. We were down having a game at Brighton. Won't mention the coach's name, but the coach at the time, I think I misplaced a pass. I was playing left back at the time. I misplaced a pass, and it was the first time in my life that I was called a "see you next Tuesday." 10 years old, and I was kind of like I didn't know what it meant. Right, I didn't know what it meant. So I remember asking my dad, like, "Dad, like what does that mean?" And it
Mm.
was really that kind of first exposure to hard line, like you said, kind of war siege. If you're not strong and you're not perfect, you're weak, and there's an exclusion element to it.
Defective.
Yeah, and that for sure, like that entire time from, I mean, that was like mid 90s through right the way through to kind of my YT stage, going in and playing full time. There was this like zero tolerance for vulnerability in any way, shape, or form. Physical vulnerability. I was a late developer physically, so I was always a little smaller. Yeah, I had my technical attributes. I was quick, and I always joke, with my parents and say if I was born 5 or 6 years later, I probably would have had a different career, because those attributes that I held as a teenager would have been, more admired and actually nurtured more. But because I wasn't the most physical, and actually as a personality, I was quite inverted compared to the kind of changing room environment of I mean, you still get it now, but like this kind of brutal changing room environment where competition was very much brought to the surface. Even though you're supposed to be in this kind of intimate team environment, within that team environment there is competition for long pro contracts. There's competition. So me playing left back, left wing, I had another guy there who we didn't get on particularly well in my position. We just didn't like each other, and that would show. And he was quite a dominating character, so I would always appear maybe submissive, even though technically and performance wise on the pitch I was better. But he would always get that preference because he was more domineering and dominating. And it's it's just really interesting. Since I've known you, you've kind of explained that was a thing, that was a period of time, and it was the norm, and you didn't have those outlets to kind of go, I'm going to go and speak to someone and they're going to empathize and not judge, and actually see that vulnerability as a strength.
Can I
Do you?
just ask you a question? What did your dad say to you about it when you asked your dad about it?
Do you know what? I can't remember. I think something like, it's like a super rude word. Like it's not something that most of us would say. But you just kind
Did he
of.
did he explain? Can you remember? Were you left with the feeling that the coach's behaviour was somehow explicable? And this isn't to criticize your dad. This is to try to understand how deep the old performance paradigm ran.
No, I think there's an element of like me. I've spent a lot of my life kind of working stuff out on myself and kind of learning kind of what things mean and how they're implied. And I think for me, the nature at that time, it was, regardless of the word, it was a very aggressive one-way interaction, right? Probably you look now, it wouldn't be tolerated at that level of under 10s, under 11s. You just wouldn't be able to do that now. But I think the aggression, and domination, I think that was very much my lived experience of the practice, coming through that kind of academy piece and then going into youth and then working more full time. Is there's just this competition for domination and a
Mm.
hierarchy, very much a hierarchy in that team environment. If I'm top of the banter, I'm the guy who's you know, playing around, messing around. I'm the guy who's almost belittling, the new guys that came in. When I came in after my GCSEs, I felt super vulnerable. And that vulnerability at that time was taken advantage of by some of the people who were older, to diminish, not to include.
Mm.
And I think that was just the culture, not placing blame at any individual. That was just the culture there of like you going through this rite of passage to harden yourself up, and you do that through just getting on with it. And, you know, I think we were quite lucky actually with our particular year going through that kind of 2 or 3 year period where we actually generally didn't want to tolerate it. Us kind of 5 or 6 that came in as 16-year-olds and moved through. By the time we were the elder ones, there wasn't so much of that. Not to say that we were perfect, but there was, we were far more welcoming of those younger people, because essentially at times it was brutal, to the point where you
Mm.
didn't want to go in and train, because that's just that was the
Mm.
nature of that kind of hierarchical um, team environment. It's great to have that packaged almost and go that actually was a period of its time, and obviously we're moving on from that. I'm sure
Yeah,
you'll find.
you need kind of concepts like this to some way to kind of in some way to help you to understand like
Mm,
history, right? And even your own to kind of go, oh, okay, like this is why all that behavior came to be. And also just to say as well, like you only need to go on and see how many likes the clips of coaches walking around training rooms slapping players in the face, or Neil Warnock back in back in 30 years ago, and to see that there is a kind of also a romantic attitude to some of that stuff as well, right? Like that it's never a beginning and an end. It's always a kind of subtle overlapping of different forces over history. But
mm,
you also mentioned about like domination and hierarchies and that kind of ruthlessness that came out in the language embodied in a coach calling a 10-year-old the C word. And a big part of the transition between the old performance paradigm to the new one, and where the Overton window kind of shifted is towards, at one stage it would have been seen that that was one of the ways in which, even if the logic wasn't wrapped around it so neatly, it would have been seen that that was one of the ways in which people were kind of restrained, right, and kept focused, and certain performers would rise to the top in that situation and appear performatively, as in not as in performance, but as in the way in which they behaved, that they cohered with the kinds of behaviors that the coach would wish to see. Maybe belittling other people, maybe, reinforcing a hierarchy. This would have been framed in some way under some banner of leadership, right? Whereas now there is a different understanding that those kinds of things are not just undesirable to the overall performance environment to get everybody to flourish, but and I'm not saying it's perfect now. I'm just saying that there was more of a recognition that these different personality types and performance profiles, different types of inputs in order to thrive. Yeah. That's a great example. And that kind of domination and that kind of language, right, of ruthlessness, somewhere in the logic tree of that, maybe the coach or the leadership think that this type of communication to a 10-year-old separates out the high performers from the sort of weak and defective ones, right? So possibly there's something in that old performance paradigm that told people to behave in that way. But of course, now we know that that doesn't work at all for most people.
no, it doesn't. Actually, probably another. It just made me think of maybe an example that's actually sits in opposition to the kind of more open performative aggression, right? Of that example is actually something a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more maybe sinister and passive. Is when I went into first signed my full-time YT at Wickham, we played our first pre-season and we played Watford, and I came on. I was a substitute, so I came on, and the dude, I think the right wing has picked up from like 35 yards, and he's absolutely smashed it. Top bins. There's nothing anyone could have done about it. And because I don't think that the youth team coach at the time really wanted me as part of it, maybe didn't think I was good enough to be a part of it, blamed me and took me straight off. I'd been on for 2 minutes, so like humiliating, and embarrassing for me. He didn't actually last, so he left the club. I think I went back to Norway, I think. And then about 6 months later, we played an FA Youth Cup game. I was playing particularly well. I had a particularly good game. And at half time, he was at the game. So at half time, I came off. I had a particularly good first half. We were coming off. And he walked past and he just said to me, I can't believe you're still here. Walt. I hadn't seen him for 6 months. And this like real, like, this guy's a grown man, probably, I can't remember, probably in his like late 40s. And like this really like kind of like you still want to kind of belittle and demean. Like it's a very
Mm.
strange behavior.
How old were you at this point?
16.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like enforcing a very particular kind of hierarchy, and what performatively what it's trying to do is it's trying to say this is the place that you belong and don't forget it, and this is the place that others belong and don't forget that either, and that to get
Mm.
to that group you must ultimately not just perform but do it in the way that we gatekeep for, right? So it's a very, again, this
Yeah.
is another quality I think of the old performance paradigm, and I'd like to talk about the World Cup actually, because the World Cup is on now, and there's just so many great examples of this movement and transition. Right, we've got you and I are both English. We've got an English team right now that's talking about chemistry all the time, and it's really interesting because we've had these fascinating selections to go into the men's team squad, which for some people, some commentators, they feel that some of the most gifted players have been left out of that. But the way it's been explained is because of chemistry and culture and the way that they want to like put people together, and ultimately that means the types of conversations they have. Now that's something I think that probably in the old performance paradigm it's very difficult for that to happen, right? I mean, it did happen from time to time. We saw really gifted players not get into England squads, but this is something that seems to be a little bit more of a hallmark now, right? It seems to be something that is much more explicable somehow.
You know,
It's yeah.
I find something really actually what maybe personifies that is your and again pundits and media, they kind of do their job, and they again they almost by the very nature of what they do pit people against people. So you know, player that didn't make it versus player that did make it, players in similar positions, who starts, who doesn't, one's going to be excluded and alienated, not going to feel good about it. But actually, a few days ago, seeing Jude Bellingham and Morgan Rogers sat next to each other
Mm,
in an interview, you can see the natural chemistry, the way they work together. And actually, you've got two players who the media would like to maybe put in direct opposition to each other,
yes, yeah, that's
but
right.
sat together talking to each other about what they bring to the squad. And actually, I think it was Morgan Rogers like said quite openly, like, people are on the bench and people play, and
Mm,
you all play your part. And it was quite symbolic, I think, actually, an interview like that I haven't seen before, maybe I've missed, but two people in that kind of, directly competing with each other for that starting berth against Croatia,
mm.
talking about their chemistry with each other. It's quite
Yeah,
interesting.
it's a good spot actually. That's something that has seeped into our language, and perhaps there is a little bit of a lag between when paradigms within the practice of the sport itself move on and when the media follows afterwards. And that language of adversariality is definitely like, of adversary, sorry, is something that is really hypnotic, right? For people, we love that, the idea that there's some kind of tension between people. But what I would say as well is you hit upon something else that I think is really symbolic of the shift, which is media and the way that now are like our interface with these teams, right? So whereas before, if you remember in the 1990s, the relationship to the media was very hostile. It was often very secret, very close, very controlled, right, on behalf of national teams. They didn't really want to let the media in. And now, because of partially the influence of social media, but not just the influence of it, the fact that the players who are young people live and breathe and interact with social media in the way that they do, which is just like the rest of us, they come to expect kind of that level of openness, right? And you can see that the media teams, they've worked really hard to create different types of experiences that players actually want to go to. Like I watched one just the other day where they have they have little quizzes, they play tenable, they have little golf games, stuff like that, right? It's a big shift in the way in which we kind of the medium that we understand our national teams, and I think it's really emblematic of how the old performance paradigm has now shifted into this new, and the kind of secrecy has now fallen down.
Yeah, and I think maybe that move shows a little more trust, I guess, from both parties, right? I think there maybe, like you said at the start there, trust was the thing that was missing. And when you're in that kind of, I guess, very stiff environment as a player, there's direct questioning, there's questions at you, that again there's that adversarial like angle, because that's what gets attention, especially in the 90s. You had relatively limited sources of news, right? You pick up your Sunday paper and you read about X, whereas now I think there is less tolerance for that. Obviously it doesn't go away, right? It gets clicks, like we said about the managers in the changing room. Like there is always a clamour for that kind of extreme ends of the scale. But actually, I think most people want to hear authenticity. They want to hear insight. They want access, which is a big thing. And so I think from, you know, I guess you've got two different sides. You've got the media side there that have to curate these experiences for players to disarm them, to relax and actually go, okay, we're providing you with an environment where you can be a bit more authentic. So, you know, like you said, the darts, you know, playing darts and talking while they're doing it feels a lot more kind of welcoming. And I think, you know, to reciprocate that, the teams and the players, you know, it's no longer an either or. You can or you can't. You kind of have to. That's part of the access and the insight. And I think it's smart, you know, going back to my example with the two guys there, like I think there's obviously a game to be played. And for England to say, okay, cool, we're going to get rid of all that adversarial chat by putting the two guys in the same position out for an interview at the same time. You know, so there's this, obviously within that there's games and there's kind of this kind of, you know, the journalists want the story, want the meaty story, but the team itself wants that kind of calm and unity. So how do you bring those two things together? So it's actually, if you observe it deeper than just kind of like scrolling through and looking, you can see how that kind of little game's playing out to really keep from a team perspective that unity, right? We want to keep the unity, the good feeling between players. We don't want there to be stories and words and statements twisted to then create that kind of adversarial him versus him, one versus two. So I think it's like the World Cup's great, because I don't think we've had probably a more exposed tournament where everyone is in front of every channel. I think it's actually quite interesting to see how that dynamic is playing out in the early stages of the tournament. And it'll be really interesting, depending on what happens, you know, if it's slightly more challenging for England, for example, can you maintain that? Can you maintain that calmness and that kind of like ability to keep
Openness.
the unity? Yeah.
Yeah, and
It'll be
also
interesting.
openness, right? Like, or do you think, because I mean, that used to be one of the trajectories, I think, of the old performance paradigm, is that openness equals fragility. And the more open the training and practice and performance environment is, the more access it comes to the players, the more distracted they become, the more kind of like vulnerable we come to media narratives that are about us, the greater the opportunity to make some kind of, you know, faux pas mistake. And so all of these things were seen as like potential critical failure points, which of course they're not, right? But you can see how easily that narrative takes hold, right? And there are plenty of performance environments today which still feel that way, right? And have that mental model for performance.
What?
But you only have to reflect. You only have to reflect on. Oh no, you only have to reflect on, you know, what we know about, you know, athletes, and what we know about athletes is really no different to what we know about ourselves, in the sense that we have a multitude of different interests. We are differently oriented when it comes to mindset, behavioral style, perspective, sensitivity to risk, sensitivity to reward, and behavioral style. Like, we have these differences, and but we don't usually just want to focus on the sport that we play all the time. We want other things in our lives as well. We have other interests, you know, we're complicated. And so the idea of openness itself, whilst it might be scary for some players, no doubt, right? And there are some players that probably would rather have as little of it as possible, because maybe it just is not their comfort zone. Totally accept. The idea of it itself is not the thing that is going to hurt performance. The act of it is not the thing that's going to hurt performance, right? But that's a difficult narrative, I think, to break.
Yeah. I think the most difficult, I think those vulnerabilities and anxieties and that openness, I think sometimes we still like feel like that's our intimacy. That's something we should hold for ourselves, and maybe, you know, those closest to us, and not necessarily be exposed to the wider world. But again, I think when you're in that, you know, we're looking at obviously the elite end with the World Cup and the players, is you kind of have no choice. They will either find you open or they'll expose a vulnerability, but they're both the same thing. But it's how it's just communicated, is
That's
they'll either dig
that's
and fight,
why
or you can be open.
that's why I think play in these media moments is such a smart call, you know. And Pip Grange did it famously with the the England football team at the 2018 World Cup and the inflatable unicorns in the swimming pool, right? But they're just ways in which you can just kind of like let some of the barriers down and appear silly or stupid, or, and, you know, just kind of like expose something about yourself without exposing everything. And it's they are steps towards flourishing as a human being, right? And also, I would argue, performing as a football player. Yeah. Where
Yeah, brilliant.
in your day, it would have been like these psychology or the idea of being vulnerable would have been reserved only for both the highest performers and in like the more traditional sense, and those people who were seen in some way as defective, they needed it.
Yeah, and I think a chronic lack of empathy and I think a lack of outlets. I think
Yeah.
for especially younger people, and you know we're dealing, you know, we're talking about players here, but as we said at the start, there are these performance paradigms we operate in. Doesn't matter where, playing teams, non-playing teams, you know, wherever you play yourself, they're the same environments.
And they that be under no doubt, like they affect the way in which the team plays seeps out in large part into other parts of the club. I still interact with people regularly in which, you know, the needs and desires of a very particular head coach when they come will dictate a lot of what happens around. And that some of that is very normal and very easy to understand, and that's all good. But it's just a way of demonstrating how the performance critical environment seeps out into the wider environment of the club or the national team.
What do you find like? 'Cause obviously, you work very intimately in these environments. Is there anything that is particularly still kind of prevalent from this old performance, you know, paradigm that you see now? Or is there anything that's particularly challenging to, you know, affect change? I guess in terms of like that 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 kind of culture.
I think that I think that, you know, culture is really nothing more than consistency under pressure. And, you know, I've written about this, that did we do what we said we would do, what we committed to do, what we promised to do when things were not going well? And intent in that regard, and this is not about individuals or in even about decisions, this is about the changing over time. Like that intent is still something that should and can be dialed up significantly. And I'm trying to think of something that's diplomatic, because these environments, whether they're in, you know, it doesn't matter what sport they're in, they're often people just doing their very best under very constrained conditions, sometimes very public, sometimes, you know, without having put their kids to bed for like, you know, 3 months. They're really like challenging environments, right? 60, 70 hour, sometimes a week environments under public scrutiny. So it's nothing that I say here is criticism. It's more just like an acknowledgement of the job to be done. And I think if you were to say, what is the job that we still need to continue under this new performance paradigm and deepen to make these cultures one where humans really thrive and we get the thing that we said that we wanted, which was winning, right? Then I think what we need to focus on is we need to focus on this idea of culture really being consistency under pressure. And this is something that I've written about before. And it's just this idea that we really kind of find out who we are when we're tested and things haven't gone quite the way that we hoped. And did we, in those moments, do what we said we would do, what we committed to, maybe what we wrote on the wall and put in places like values and purpose statements and visions? And when things started to fall apart, did we honor the strength of connections that existed between us when things were going really great? And leading with very high levels of intent in that regard, you know, explaining why certain things are happening and, you know, over communicating in places and being efficient in communication in others, and just like understanding that in a really emotionally intelligent way is the key job that all of us need, I think, to hold each other accountable on.
Yeah, it's such a good phrase, consistency under pressure. And that can be used, you know, obviously we're doing this from a team environment, but that can be used across any context. Who are you when things are challenging, and that's team basis, individual basis. To finish off on this point, and maybe this will lead us into other conversations, for again our kind of audience, maybe the individual who again is going to be or has recently moved into these team environments, this pressurized, high speed, intimate environments, is there anything you can kind of say to them? Are there particular qualities that they should kind of be thinking about, learning more or engaging with more? You mentioned there about communication and over communicating, maybe as an example. Is there anything beyond that kind of individual can go, cool, I'm excited by this opportunity to move into this team or work in this particular environment. I'm aware now that there are certain behaviors that we're kind of boxing here into old performance and are kind of what we're looking out for in this kind of new performance. What do you feel they need to kind of be aware of or engage with?
I would ask that they think about, it's very similar actually to the theme that we picked up in our last conversation, and they should think about their ability to kind of roll with the chaos and pilot that chaos and navigate change and optimize their performance with that in mind, rather than thinking about particular skills and experiences that they need to build, which I just believe in almost, unless you and I want to try to go back to become professional footballers, then a lot of things can actually just be learned on the job. But your ability to deal with uncertainty and volatility is going to be put to the test from day one, and optimize for that, because these environments are still extremely demanding environments, right? And they are filled with beautiful, wonderful people who, are trying their very, very best, with now, especially over the last 15 years, a deep commitment to the growth of humans and to their thriving. There are many, many places that are like that now, and probably a lot more than certainly in the intent of the individuals that work there, a lot more than the media would give credit to. But of course, there's still a huge amount of work to be done in that regard as well. And I would just say that, yeah, you've got to be able to deal and navigate with uncertainty, because uncertainty is a reality from day one, and sport sadly is still very much impacted and affected by that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think we've mentioned it actually quite a lot in this chat as a thread. Is you've said that you can romanticize about a job or a team or an opportunity, but it's tough. It's high pressure. It's quick. It's brutal at times. Um, Often there is little time from the senior hierarchy to spend time with you and talk with you. That is just the nature of the beast, and you are going to get thrown in, and it's going to be really tough on you. But openness has very much kind of been the thread of the conversation, and I think from my lived experience, when you engage with openness throughout that pressure, I think that's definitely helped me, and I think it will help people listening navigate that pressure, navigate and pilot the chaos, as you say, being able to articulate that journey of yours, in whichever outlet you want. That may not necessarily be someone in your workplace. It may be someone at home or a confidant or a mentor. So, anyone like that is actually being able to be open and going, cool, this is tough, but we're going to, I'm going to engage in that consistency under pressure, as opposed to kind of holding on. And I know the more I held on, actually, the more it affected my performance. The pressure didn't go anywhere, but actually, when I'm more open and people know where they are with me and vice versa, I perform at my best. Maybe as a thread, being open as an individual, but also open to the chaos, open to, you know, things often not working out the way you want them to.
Openness to new experience, let's start there. Like, if we can work on that, lean into that. Many of us don't naturally orient in that way, and like the role of subconscious is to protect you and keep you the same. So it's completely normal to not experience high levels of openness to new experience, but just working on that and dialing that up a little bit, because you are going to be overwhelmed at the beginning. And I was I'm not sure if that is related to the old performance or the new performance paradigm or the new performance paradigm, for which I'm not quite sure. It's emergent right now what that's going to contain, right, as we pass into it. But so yeah, I would say dial up that as much as you can, and yeah, join. In season 1, there's some helpful hints and on how to get started in that journey.